Hello, this is Matthias Goertz with my monthly COVID update. The title hasn't changed much. Still no light at the end of this particular tunnel. This is a Chinese tunnel. Yeah, not so much has changed since a month ago. So I haven't changed the picture and I haven't changed much of the headline either. That's the date, 1st of July. So welcome. Start with a quote. Philo, Hellenized Jewish philosopher in Alexandria in the 1st century, the Common Era. Quite a practical guy and not really an out-of-the-box thinker in my view, but so it's interesting what he says. Essentially, he says, don't lean too far out of the window unless you have something really important to say. Don't attack those in power because they could just simply push back very easily. And if you don't really have an opportunity to change anything, just shut up. So I brought this because I thought about it. Yeah, maybe that's me, huh? I'm like barking up a tree, but it doesn't have any impact. So why not just simply shut up? Not quite yet, I would say. I mean, eventually I will not continue this forever, but I'm not quite there yet. I think I will want to continue observing for at least, let's say, a full 3 years of COVID, and my start date there is March 2020, when the virus came out of China and into the rest of the world. So until March next year or so, I think I shall continue. I'm curious to see how this third autumn and winter period that is coming up in a few months, how that will be. And then maybe after 3 years, there's nothing more to learn that I haven't already learned. So we'll see. Yeah. So just a little sort of pragmatic advice, don't waste your time, don't hurt yourself. But I'm here anyway, so welcome again. Yeah, I've been talking a bit about the invasion of the Ukraine. Just like on the COVID front, on the Ukrainian front, not very much has moved. The Russians focusing on the Donbas. They've practically taken a major city in the Donbas, Severodonetsk. I think it's a bit like a déjà vu of Mariupol, where a few hundred soldiers in the end, Ukrainian soldiers, were sort of holding out in a steelworks. And I think in this Donbas city, a few hundred Ukrainian soldiers are still holding out in a chemicals factory run by the same state conglomerate, Azov or similar. But it's only a question of time, it seems, till the Russians will have taken that important city. I don't know what that then means, whether they will then be able to accelerate their advance or not. So maybe just put up the little signs here, yeah. Remember, I had put these rings or ovals. So the big red oval, that's where the Russians are focusing. And you can see within that oval is an area that is part of a province. So you see the gray boundary. And, my guess is they want, pretty much all of that province, which is sort of a conventional way of defining the Donbas. So they want all of the Donbas, plus, of course, the Mariupol land bridge between the Donbas and Crimea, which they already have. So they will continue defending that. And I think then they may be satisfied with, in terms of territorial objectives. And maybe there will be a point where they will start engaging more seriously in peace talks. But they will not return any of the land that they've occupied, or very little of it, even whatever the deal making may be. And it would be difficult in the long run to get them out of these territories. I mean, remember how they held on to Crimea without much resistance, and they held on to those sort of parts of the Donbas that they had, where they had supported a local insurrection. You know, I mean, these kind of territories, you don't need a huge force to hold it. So I think they will. On the Kherson front, I don't think much has happened. I think the Kherson mayor has been fired by the Russians because maybe, you know, he was not sufficiently pro-Russian. And the Snake Island, so-called Snake Island, which is here at the very bottom, which is literally sort of actually out off the coast of Romania, perhaps the southernmost point in the Ukraine, if you don't count the Crimea. This little island was strategically important because the Russians occupied it early on and held onto it until recently. And the idea was that from there they would be able to control the supply, the shipping lines out of Odessa, which is Ukraine's main remaining harbor. But just in the last few days, they've apparently evacuated Snake Island, apparently because the Ukrainians received sort of longer term and more longer distance and more capable missiles from maybe the Americans. And they started bombarding, shooting rockets at those Russian installations on that island. And apparently the Russians have decided it's not worth holding on to. So they gave it up. But just interesting. I mean, you know, Putin, remember when he didn't get into Kiev within a few days or weeks, which he probably had expected, he reviewed the situation. Eventually he said, okay, we're not going to take Kiev, we're going to withdraw from there. Right? Snake Island is a smaller thing, but you can see the pattern. Putin is quite willing to selectively move back or retrench if it becomes too costly to hold on to some territory that is maybe not as important to him. It probably tells you that he accepts that the Ukraine will be an independent nation, that he cannot sort of just simply control it the way maybe he does Belarus. And maybe the Snake Island was part of such a plan where you set up, military installations, naval installations in key locations and basically control the country, even if it is notionally independent. But I don't see that that's still really in the cards. I think Putin just says, I have a certain view as to which territories I want to seize. And I think he's not quite there yet, because in the Donbas, it's been slow, but he's getting there. And then, at some point he will say, okay, the cost of the war is starting to outweigh the benefits, so to speak. And he's made his point, and he will look like a victor because he will have conquered significant land territory, about 20% or so of the entire Ukraine, which is a big country. So these are big territories. He will be able to say, okay, we are satisfied, and let's talk about a peace, right? And he will try to negotiate some of the sanctions away, maybe in exchange for retrenching somewhere along that very long front. There may be some pockets there that are difficult to hold on to, and he may not want. So we will see, right? Now, this can still take several months. It could even take years. to get to that point, because I think, as I said, he still wants, I think, all of Donbass, and the Ukrainians are fighting tooth and nail. And as long as the West keeps supplying them with decent weapons, they can hold the fort quite long. And it's becoming very costly for Russia. So, yeah, it's interesting. But we'll see. I mean, yeah, not that much has happened since last month. And I suspect in a month's time, when we meet again, not that much will have happened either. It's a slow grinding, shifting of boundaries, a few hundred meters at a time. So, yeah, but that's it. And, I'm not sure either side will blink first, right? Putin has his objectives and he's still holding on to them in the Donbass. And Zelensky wants to free all of Ukraine. Of course, that's his job as president. But, he will, of course, he will not. I think that's quite out of the question, that the Russians would just simply give up, what they have gained. Okay. There we go. Oh yeah, in terms of that fossil fuels from Russia, just saw this the other day, interesting slide. Someone put this together saying, well, who are the big buyers? And what's interesting is these are the top, 20 or so. And most of them are NATO members or EU members, or in most cases, both. Right? And I mean, we've talked about this before, right? The EU accounting for more than 60% of all Russian oil and gas exports, right? And 67% of total Russian exports. So, I mean, this is no surprise in that sense, but we knew that. But it's still sort of interesting to see it country by country, because what I took away is, one, okay, China is now the biggest buyer, but not by much. And it's such a huge economy. There's probably upward potential. So China could, grow their offtake from Russia, if they want to. Now, the Chinese economy over the next year or two is going to be quite weak, it seems. So it's not clear that they will massively increase their demand for any of such fossil fuels. But what they, of course, could do is, if Russia offers them significant discounts relative to global market prices, they may start swapping out of other contracts or other suppliers, maybe not out of contracts, but out of suppliers, or moving the future demand away from some of their established suppliers and towards Russia, right? Just because Russia may be giving them the stuff cheaper. So China still has a bit of upward potential, I would say, but maybe not that much. And then you go down the list, and the next country that could be a potential, buyer stepping up and trying to replace some of the reduced purchases from EU countries, right? And that would be India. But you can see India is only number 8 or so on the list. It's not that big. It's slightly bigger than Bulgaria or Belgium, which are small countries, right? So India, for such a huge country, isn't actually buying that much from Russia at the moment. Now, they could step that up perhaps significantly, again, if Russia gives them significant discounts, right? They'd be even more sensitive to, price sensitive than China. Right? For India, the price will always beat any other consideration, because the country just doesn't have yet so much money per capita, right? And they, if they have to pay world market prices and they've just doubled, that hurts, Indian consumers and buyers disproportionately because of the relatively low GDP per capita. So India has a strong incentive to buy from whoever offers good terms, right? And Russia can do that. Right? So India, I think, can bump up their purchases over the next months or years quite significantly, but still, let's say it doubles over the next year or two. That's possible, I think, given they're starting from a low base, but it still won't compensate Russia if those EU members really continue significantly driving down their demand. Germany has already reduce their dependency on Russian gas from over 60% to, I think, something like just over 40%. That is very significant. Of course, the next winter is coming and they will need more gas and da-da-da, but I think there are actually quite significant shifts now going on in Europe to really try to wean themselves of the Russian product and raw material. And that's, we talked about, it's limited how quickly you can do that because you need alternatives, da-da-da. It's not easy, but they're doing that, I think. And so there is a real chance here that within maybe a year or so, the volume of Russian sales of fossil fuels will have gone down, and maybe quite significantly, because it doesn't look on this list that there are a lot of players who can compensate or offtake what the Europeans no longer want. And Egypt is at the bottom. They could probably ramp up their demand, and there will be others further down that are not shown on the graphic. But if they're starting from a very low base, it takes time to ramp that up, right? Again, even if you double it within a year or two, which would be quite a push, if you start from a very low base, it doesn't move the needle that much. So the Europeans, on the one hand, are so dependent on Russian gas, which limits their options to some degree, but I think Russia is even more dependent on the Europeans buying their stuff, right? Because there are not many other players that are significant that can compensate as a market. That's, I think, quite interesting. I hadn't thought about that before. I only started thinking about that when I saw this chart, this distribution. So this is going to start hurting Russia, and there's a double whammy. Right now, I talked about how their revenues and profits, their revenues have doubled and their profits probably grown faster, right? Which is normally the case. If your cost base maybe doesn't change that much, right? Then your profits go through the roof, right? And that's what the government then hives off via taxation or whatever. So they've been doing very well. And as I said, basically the rising fuel prices, global prices have basically paid for the war so far. But if you look at this, I mean, if the Europeans really stick to it and really start driving this down significantly, and the investments take some time to materialize and to have an effect, but so that the bigger effect will not happen in the next few months, perhaps, but it will happen maybe next winter, and then especially the year after, I suspect, right? When lots of new facilities have been erected and new contracts with other suppliers have been entered, etc., etc. So, over maybe not so much over the next 6 months, but maybe over the next 12 or 18 months, we might see a significant reduction in volume purchased by Europe, right? And that will be very hard for Russia to replace. So their volume will go down. Now, I said, well, they're doing so well because the price has doubled. So even the volumes go down somewhat. If the price doubles, they're still doing very well. Yes, but if they then are forced to offer significant discounts to players like China or India to offtake some of their excess capacity, then some of that sort of windfall we talked about from the war is then eroded. So I can see a little bit of light at the end of this particular tunnel. Over the next, and I'll make this up, 6 to 18 months is sort of my gut feel, Russia will increasingly no longer be able to make so much money from these raw materials that it can essentially fund the war just with that money. That is going to go away. And that suggests that within the next 6 to 18 months, Putin will want to get some settlement, because it will really start hurting Russia more than the sanctions. Yeah. So we'll see, but watch that space. Right? Okay, that was Russia and Ukraine. Now we talk about COVID. So in no particular order, maybe just by date, just a few, again, my usual comments on newspaper articles that I happen to stumble across. 2 million people in the UK are living with long COVID. Find studies. Now, first of all, long COVID is not defined. So the headline is already nonsense. You cannot find something in a study for something that is not defined. Right? So first of all, COVID is not defined, and I have a definition, which is pneumonia, right? COVID is just another word for a pneumonia triggered by SARS-CoV-2, right? But since I seem to be almost the only person using that definition, they must have some definition that in some way or another makes no sense, right? As I said before, there's no such thing as COVID, right? That is distinct, other than this particular pneumonia being triggered by this particular virus. But this virus, in the end of the day, is no different than, you know, hundreds of other viruses that trigger pneumonia. So other than being new, yeah, so I don't need to repeat myself again and again. I've said this many times, but other than being new, yeah. Other than that, it's an ordinary cold virus. So what is the phenomenon? So they experience symptoms. They see here, breathlessness, muscle aches, fatigue for months or even years. Yeah. Well, it's not at all clear how you define. How do you know that's linked? If let's say you had an infection with SARS-CoV-2. Okay, so let's take the case of someone who had a severe infection, maybe had actually pneumonia, or they had bronchitis, or they had at least a very severe cold. I mean, those cases all exist, right? If you had a severe infection, and it has nothing to do with COVID, first of all, then of course that has an impact on your immune system and your body. There is no doubt, right? So any infection has a long tail, potentially. Right? If it is a severe infection, and depending on, of course, your overall state of health, since a lot of the people who have severe symptoms are elderly, I mean, of course, any significant infection, the same would be true for influenza, for example. It can linger on in the body. It can have all kinds of side effects, and those side effects can be long-term. There's no question about this. Right? So if that's the studies find that, then I'm just saying, yeah, you don't need a study for that. Because obviously that's the case, right? But it's got nothing to do with this particular virus. I mean, this virus is no different than all the others. That's what I'm saying. Yeah? Yes, of course, you can have long-lasting secondary effects or side effects from a severe infection. Yes, of course, any severe infection. Okay? So in a way, they're talking about something that is either nothing or it's everything. It's like, yeah, of course, there's such a thing as long side effects. But, if you had a severe infection, right? And maybe some certain conditions apply, which those would be maybe interesting to study, but then don't study just for this particular one virus. You know what? I mean, the funny thing is now so much money is flowing into the research around this virus that, I mean, if it's an interesting question to understand better those long-term effects from infections, and do it for many infections, not just for one, right? Okay, you got to start somewhere, yeah, fine. And this is where the money flows right now. The reason we have all these articles is because this is where the money flows right now, not because it's a particularly interesting question. It isn't, at least not the way it's framed here by the reporter, right? So mind you, I haven't actually read the studies behind it. Of course, sometimes you find the studies are actually really quite good, right? And just what the reporters make of them is a different story. So forgive me that I haven't read any of the studies that are behind this. I've just, taken this newspaper article. But yeah, we're talking about something that is not defined. We're talking about symptoms that are completely unspecific. Breathlessness, muscle aches, fatigue. Yeah, I have that. It's got to do with getting older. So I don't want to joke about it too much, but I mean, these are completely unspecific symptoms, right? They can be caused by any number of things. So, I mean, what the hell is their way, again, I should maybe read the studies, but what the hell is their way of knowing that these symptoms have anything to do with the infection that person may have had a month or two earlier? I mean, how do they, for example, know that it's not just another infection? I mean, we get 4 common colds per year on average. And that's counting only the symptomatic ones, right? I mean, we are exposed to viruses all the time, every day, every minute, every second, right? 4 times a year on average, globally, adults have the symptoms of a cold, recognizably, right? Okay, so I mean, you could easily, a month after having had this cold triggered by this particular virus, you could have another cold triggered not necessarily by SARS-CoV-2, but by any number of other cold viruses, you know, or a flu or other things. Right? So how do they know that if someone has these symptoms, that they're actually linked in any way to their, you know, SARS-CoV-2 infection? I mean, if they had a severe infection, I would say, yeah, it's very likely. So you have a high probability that it's linked, right? And that is a good hypothesis, although it's not certain. Right? But if they had like, you know, no or few symptoms, just a light cold or medium cold, I mean, a normal cold, and just because they tested positive for SARS-CoV-2, you then say, oh, any symptoms that come later must be COVID, long COVID. No, they may or may not be, right? So, I mean, the way that the reporter presented is completely unscientific. Now, I cannot believe that the studies are this unscientific, but the reporter obviously doesn't really care about that. The problem is, I mean, this is The Guardian, I mean, a well-respected newspaper. The problem is 2.5 years into this, the reporters still do not know what they're talking about, and this is not helpful. People read this and, oh, long COVID, oh, long COVID, oh. It's not defined, okay? Damage to organs such as heart and lungs, yeah, possible. Again, a severe infection can do that, yes, but that's not new. Okay, the ones after being hospitalized. So there, at least he's talking about those who had a severe infection. Okay, good. Those are maybe interesting to study, yes, but I mean, again, any pneumonia can do this to you, right? If you're an old person. So why, if it's so interesting to study, why haven't we been doing that, right? Okay, the money didn't flow to pneumonia. In a moment where you label it COVID, the money flows, right? So maybe it's just a marketing strategy. Someone was smart. Let's not call it pneumonia. That sounds so banal. Let's call it COVID. Oh, then the money will come. And here it goes, right? Okay. 20% of people saying they have been limited a lot in their daily activities. That's completely out of like hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, that's completely unbelievable, right? I don't know how they survey this, right? I think there is something here psychologically. Someone has said COVID, people are scared. Oh, COVID is so uncertain, they don't understand it. And then they have some kind of symptoms. Oh, I feel tired. Oh, it must be COVID, COVID, COVID. Oh, no. Oh, I have long COVID. If it's just a survey where they ask people, oh, have you tested positive in the last, whatever, 6 months or 12 months? Yes, okay. So you're in one group. If you say no, then you're in the other group, right? But if you're like, yes, okay. And now, do you have any like symptoms that you feel, oh, I'm so fatigued? Oh, you have long COVID. I'm also sometimes fatigued, yeah, by this stuff. We have now created a far larger cohort of the chronically unwell and disabled than we previously had, say, with the entire national burden of rheumatoid arthritis. And the healthcare, you know, arthritis is a severe, serious thing for elderly people, especially. I mean, this is just incredible that someone is just making statements here, completely unsupported. I mean, at least not by this article. Or maybe again, there's some studies somewhere. But again, this isn't even defined. Arthritis, I think, is quite well defined, although it's a complex issue, so it may have, even that may not be. I mean, that's the problem with health things. You know, they're difficult to define. I understand that, but this is basically plain nonsense. This article. It tells you absolutely nothing about what might happen in the longer term if you've had a heavy, severe infection. It is just someone writing under the COVID umbrella, under that label, and his article will inevitably be published. And researchers who need research grants, yeah, they do. They say, oh, study includes, COVID. They say 10 times COVID in the study, the money will come. And these people are then the ones, oh, there's so much misinformation out there. Yeah, right. All those bad social media and all those conspiracy theorists who spread all this false information, like the Matthiases of the world. Yeah. Right. Professor Danny Altman. Yeah, Mr. Professor, I hope you know what you're doing. Okay. Pfizer seeks authorization of COVID vaccine for young children. Now, these are those headlines where I get like a headache, right? Under 5-year-olds in small doses. This is not that the children do not need the vaccine. For children, this is much worse. I mean, it's not just a waste of vaccine, right? I know there's very little risk to the child, but there's very little risk to the child whether or not they have the vaccine. So the vaccine just simply does nothing, right? It does one thing, it does one thing, and that's a bad thing. It prevents the child's immune system from naturally engaging with the virus. It doesn't prevent it entirely, but it prevents it partially. Because the vaccine potentially prevents the child from interacting with the virus because it repels it, or even if the child gets infected, the infection may be quite mild, or mild is the wrong word, relatively few viral load will get through, and it will be vehemently attacked by the vaccine. The vaccine just triggers the antibodies that then attack, okay? But as I said before, the vaccine only mimics one aspect of the virus, right? And only one aspect, usually of one or two variants of the virus. It does not replace a regular exposure of the child to this virus in all its complexity and diversity. It doesn't replace that. So it crowds out our normal, natural immune system's engagement with these pathogens, and this is again true for all pathogens. And in brackets, yes, there are a few where you have like childhood diseases where a vaccine is a really good idea. There are a few of those, but COVID, so-called, isn't one of them. Right? SARS-CoV-2 isn't one of them. There are very few where it makes sense to vaccinate the child early on, because the vaccine will usually last for a lifetime. It gives you basically almost full protection, and if you're not protected, children may be very susceptible to these so-called childhood diseases. So those are cases where vaccination makes sense, no doubt. Right? This is not it. This is a cold virus. Right? So this just doesn't make any sense for anybody other than Pfizer. And I don't want to hammer on corporates. All they do is maximize profits for their shareholders, and I accept that. That's what they're for. That's the only thing a corporate is for. It's just a legal structure that allocates resources to maximize profits for its shareholders. That's what a corporate entity does, right? And that's what they're doing here. Hey, we haven't tapped into the under 5-year-olds yet. Hey, there's more money to be made. It's understandable. And yes, they of course, there's nothing illegal here as far as I can tell. I'm not suggesting there is, right? They do all the clinical studies, and they go to the government and the FDA and say, look, we've studied and it's all safe for the children. Yeah, I totally believe that. I totally believe that it's safe for the children. But it is counterproductive. In the long run, these children will have a weaker immune system with respect to this particular family of viruses. I call it family of viruses now because eventually SARS-CoV-2 will not only have subvariants, but it will have basically a new strands as we have this influenza, right? And the strands are quite different, and they're almost like a different virus, but not quite, right? So I call it a family. It's not a technical term. I just make it up. But, so you have a spread of different SARS-CoV-2 related viruses and variants. And you want to, as a child, you want to be exposed. And as you get older, as you just normal development, you just want to be continuously exposed to these viruses because it keeps your immune system, on its toes, right? And updates your immune system with any information about new variants or new strains that have come along, right? And the more you do that, and the younger you are when you do that, the safer you are later when you're 80 or 90, right? Because throughout your life, you've been encountering this virus in all its variety and complexity. That's what the immune system is for. A vaccine to a child doesn't fully undermine the work of the immune system, but it slows it down. Yeah. And I cannot quantify by how much, right? But conceptually, it slows it down. And it makes the immune system it gives the immune system allows the immune system fewer opportunities to engage with the natural virus, which is all around us, right? It's everywhere around us in the air, this virus, right? So, but because the vaccine provides, at least for a while, a strong defense, the immune system basically, it does kick in, but in a very managed and limited manner, rather than the full breadth of it. That is my criticism of all this vaccination, right? And especially for children. So this is really bad news. They say it's safe, but that's not the question. The question is it useful? The answer is no, it's not useful. Not only is it not useful, it's counterproductive. It's potentially damaging to the immune system of this child in the long run. Damaging, not that it has actively damaged it, damaging in the sense that it has prevented it from developing normally, which is a sort of a damage, right? Again, the vaccine doesn't do anything bad, except it prevents the good. Yeah, and that is wrong. We are on a slippery slope of no longer believing at all in our natural capabilities and competencies, and that may not just be the case for our immune system, that is maybe the case overall for our body, and maybe most importantly for our mind. People, you could see in COVID, right, do not trust their own individual capacities. They depend on others, on systems, on technologies, on administrations, on so-called experts. They can no longer trust in themselves. And that is very remarkable. I mean, the history of Homo sapiens, surely until maybe a few thousand years ago, every individual mattered, and every individual had to, first of all, depend on themselves. And maybe since we started to do agricultural food production, and then we had the first city-states, and then we had the first empires, and globalization now, and so on, and industrialization. More and more, we have become dependent on so many other things and lost the confidence in our own capacities. I personally find that very, very disturbing and very sad. There you go. 2-year-olds now are no longer supposed to expose themselves normally to a cold virus. Population drop in Japan, 640,000 in a single year. That's quite a lot out of 125 or 126 million. The biggest drop ever, most likely related to COVID policies, I should say. Difficult to prove at the moment, right? Of course, I talked about it, a massive increase in suicides, etc. So some of the drivers you can identify, but overall, it's difficult to say, well, this is directly linked to the the government's policies. I'm sure it is, but it would be difficult to quantify. I mean, Japan was already on a downward trend with population, right? Population shrinking for a number of years already, but this is apparently double of what it had been shrinking for, but the year before. So there has been an acceleration of the drop. I have no doubt that it's quite closely linked to COVID, but again, when I say COVID, I mean COVID policies. But it's hard to prove, and it doesn't need to be proven either. Maybe the more interesting question, I talked about it, is will eventually, when the policies start to go away, even in Japan, eventually they will go away, at least partially go away, will there be a rebound, right? As we have seen in previous crises like the world wars and so on, there was a drop during the war, but then as soon as the war was over, there was a rebound. And the trend line that existed before the war basically continued. So the war didn't have long-term, it had short-term impact, but not long-term impact on the total number of people, or barely. So the question here is, will that happen here? Or is this a step function down where durably these births that could have taken place? So let's say without COVID, it would have been half. It would have been 320 down. So an additional 320,000 babies were not born because of COVID policies. The government may have saved a few thousand lives with their policies, but they have destroyed 320,000 babies, potential babies. Sorry, they never existed, right? But they would have existed, right? Just by their policies, right? That's what I'm claiming, and again, I can't prove that. Now, again, if there's a rebound, then you may say, okay, it wasn't actually, these births were not permanently eliminated, they were just delayed, and that's okay. Yeah, we'll see. I think I said before that this population impact will need several years to really understand. But yeah, I just wanted to show this because it is quite dramatic, and maybe Japan is an outlier, and of course Japan is one of the most strict policy regimes around COVID, so this is not representative necessarily for the rest of the world. But there it is. Okay, what is this? Omicron is turning out to be a weak vaccine. Yeah, that's the thing, right? It is not preventing reinfection. Yeah, it's not, and it doesn't have to, because infection or reinfection is meaningless, so it's irrelevant. That's the fundamental flaw in all the discussions and all the policies we've had for 2.5 years. This is not about preventing infection. This is about preventing the virus from getting into the lung and triggering a misreaction by the immune system. And that happens primarily in elderly people and a few other risk groups, right? That is the issue. There's no need to prevent reinfection. None of the common cold viruses do that. And our body has evolved over millions of years probably dealing with these viruses in a way that it has recognized that it's not worthwhile keeping them completely out of the system. It would take a huge effort. I mean, like in economics, there has to be a payoff for your investment. And to try to prevent any and all of these 200 plus cold viruses, and on top of that, the influenza viruses and some others, to go all out to try to prevent them from infecting our body would be a complete misinvestment. It would be a huge effort for the immune system. It would take huge amount of energy and resource in our body for no very important reason, because most of these are perfectly harmless for us most of the time. It's very rare that these, for example, cold viruses do anything bad to us, unless they're new, as in this case. For a while, they do, but just because they're new, and after a while, they're no longer new, right? So they no longer matter. So the body and evolution has decided over millions of years, it's not worth preventing reinfection. It's just simply not worth it. So it just allows it to happen. And it just makes sure that it reacts fast enough so that the virus doesn't slip down into the lower respiratory system. And in almost all cases, that works beautifully well. And is there a 100% guarantee? No. Is there a 100% safety? No. Never in nature, never. Right? And we eventually do die. And yes, in the past, often in conjunction with infectious diseases. Yeah. And that's just because the same logic, right? Because it would be uneconomical to try to keep us individuals alive forever. The older we get, the effort to do that grows exponentially. There's no value to nature and to us, to be honest, in getting ever older if it's such a huge investment. I mean, nature is so much more clever than that. They've invented reproduction, and all we do is we just reproduce ourselves into a new individual who is, young, right? That is a much more productive way to ensure the survival of the species than to try to prevent each and every individual from dying. So the only thing people would have to let go of is the notion that it's all about their individual being. As you know, I'm very much in favor of individualism and individual values, and the individual matters most in human affairs. I believe in all of that, but not to the degree that I would say, therefore, each individual must live forever. It would be terrible, it would be unbearable. And I understand that people try to extend their life and that they want to live healthy and that they try to prevent, disease, and that's all understood. It's all understood. But we are just completely misinvesting at the moment in relation to SARS-CoV-2. It's complete misallocation of resources and complete stress on our social systems, on our legal structures, on our constitutions, for no reason. Totally wasted. And a lot of that has to do with these types of stories. Just to prevent reinfection. No, it doesn't. No, it won't, and it doesn't have to. It shouldn't, actually. We need to be exposed to this virus as often as possible, really. I'm not suggesting you actively go out and catch it, but just live normally. People want to know, am I safe or not? I mean, what a question. Life is never fully safe, but other than that, yeah, of course you're safe. I mean, you don't, every time you walk on the street, you don't ask, am I safe? Am I safe? No, I mean, you look out a little bit and you behave like a rational person. You don't step right in front of a big truck that is coming your way, right? But you don't all the time think, am I safe? Am I safe? Can I cross the street? Of course you are safe. If you're in a risk group, then you just get a booster shot once a year. I've talked about that, and then you're pretty safe too. So this is so simple, I guess. So the variables are so complex and the data so limited. No, bullshit. I mean, you need to know three things, I believe. A, you are mortal. Most people don't seem to realize that. You will die of something, right? And this is not the worst thing that can happen to you. There are much worse ways of dying. Over years, with cancer. I mean, if you prefer that, I don't think I do. So you have to be aware that you're mortal. Something is going to kill you. Right? Secondly, you have to understand that you have an immune system. And in all likelihood, the immune system has no problem with this virus. And it actually needs to expose to this virus in order to learn and to keep you safe in the longer run, not only in the short run, but for the rest of your life. Right? That's the second thing. You have an immune system. And the third thing is, this is a common cold virus. It's completely harmless and in and by itself. Only because it is still relatively new to us and our immune systems haven't encountered it in the past, and especially not when we were young, when our immune system was shaped very, very rapidly by its, viral environment. This virus wasn't there when we were young, right? So we couldn't have been exposed to it. So yes, it's coming late in our life for people like me, and therefore our immune system is a bit slower, and it doesn't adjust to it quite as easily as it would have if I was 40 years younger. But nevertheless, it's just a common cold virus, right? All the immune system has to do is prevent it from slipping down into the lung. And even if it gets into the lung and triggers the pneumonia, the immune system normally can deal with pneumonias quite well. So unless you're an elderly person or you have severe sort of risk factors, there is absolutely nothing complex about this. And even if you are in the risk group, you just get your boosters every year. They are available. And so your strategy is different. You're not exposing voluntarily, you're not exposing yourself to the virus. Rather, because you start very late in your life to encounter this virus, and at your first encounter, the risk is already pretty high, you probably prefer to get the vaccine than taking your, hoping for your luck in, exposing yourself naturally. So that's very understandable. And only you yourself can define whether you think you're at risk or not, right? That's an individual choice. I cannot, there's no clear-cut definition of it. There are statistics that you can look at, but you define for yourself, do you think you are at risk? If you feel you're at risk, by all means, and are you willing to say, instead of naturally exposing myself to the virus and learning to deal with it, I don't want to take that risk, I'd rather take the vaccine. That's good for you. But then if you're really worried, then you probably really want to get a booster every so often for the rest of your life, which is also recommended for elderly people for influenza. So it's a bit similar, right? You may not need the boosters. Maybe you got 2 shots. Maybe that already triggered your immune system and it's already good enough. You've already maybe encountered the virus anyways and you just don't know. All of that is possible. But if you want to be on the safe side and you're an elderly person, yeah, it's a rational choice to get vaccinated and then continue reboosting. Yeah, but that only applies for a relatively small proportion of the population. Globally, about 10% of the global population are above 65, for example. And then there are, of course, some who are severely obese, who are below 65 and who are obese or have diabetes, etc. So I talked about this before. Maybe 20% of the global population may consider themselves at risk, or maybe 15. That's subjective, right? But the vast majority of people, it's very simple. You're mortal, you have an immune system, which is a wonder weapon, in case you haven't noticed. It serves you very well every day and every night, 365 days per year. It serves you very well. And thirdly, this particular virus is completely normal. It's a cold virus of which we have more than 200. So there's absolutely nothing unusual about this, except that it is new. And you need to get through that newness, because eventually it will not longer be new to you, and you'll be, it will be just like all the other 200 cold viruses. It's only in the early stage you have to get through it, and you have 2 options. Either you just get through it naturally, which is recommended, which I recommend for most people, or you go the vaccination route because you don't want to take the risk. That is also understandable. But it's so simple. I mean, this is about 5 minutes. I can explain it to you, right? That's it. That's all you need to know. There's nothing else. And all the other stuff that is being talked about is basically irrelevant or misleading or even counterproductive, right? So no, the variables are not complex at all. And the data is not limited at all, because actually you don't need data. We need some data. I mean, I studied the Wuhan virus, the early research out of Hong Kong. I studied the early research out of Germany quite carefully. So yes, you do need some data about the virus, right? How does it function? You need to get to the point where you can, with confidence, say, oh, this is cold virus. because it just behaves just like a cold virus. And there has to be nothing in the development of the virus that suggests otherwise, right? So you do need some data to just reconfirm what type of animal you're talking about, right? But other than that, you don't really need any data. Well, sorry, yeah, you do need the distribution data, who is at risk, right, by age group and by some other factors. That data is also very useful because then you can pinpoint, okay, I'm in that group, or, you know, I don't care, right? So there are a few data points that you need, but those have been all available for over 2 years now. And, you know, the problem is only that these articles don't talk about the relevant stuff. So you have to dig it out yourself, but it's there. The Spanish showed the pyramid of, you know, the risk factor inverted pyramid, like it goes up like exponentially as you get older. They showed that graphic when they had done a nationwide study in May 2020. It was publicly, early May 2020, and the French as well. I mean, it was publicly available, right? I saw it. So if you wanted to know who is affected, there it is, right? Yes, and the Spanish have a certain demographics, and some other countries have a different demographic, understood, but, you know, we're all human beings, and it's not that different, right? So yes, you can maybe normalize for demographics and so on, and if you have a special condition, you say, oh, but I'm different, but yeah, understand. But broadly speaking, that's it. I mean, there's very little data you need, and it was available more than 2 years ago. And ever since, it's just, nobody talks about the relevant data. Yeah. So no, it's not complex, and the data is not limited. This is just plain wrong. Just because they don't understand what is relevant and what is not relevant. That's the problem. They have no conceptual understanding of this virus or of our immune system or what it means to be a human being. The number one thing that it means is that you're mortal, okay? So are other life forms, I know, but yeah, we share that with all the other life forms. Protection against sublineages, Omicron offers very little protection. Again, this is wrong in that if you've been exposed to Omicron, it will give you a significant boost to your immune system from preventing the virus to slip next time, right? To slip down into your lungs. So any encounter gives you an additional protection, right? But because they think of protection as defined as protection from reinfection. No, it doesn't protect you from reinfection. That's true. So the statement here is correct. It just has the wrong definition of what it talks about. You don't need to be protected against reinfection. You need to be protected against the stuff getting into your lung and wreaking havoc. And every encounter with the virus will improve your protection, including every encounter with Omicron and any subvariant thereof. So in that sense, this statement is precisely wrong. It is correct if you have a wrong definition of what it means to be protected. So you see the problem. This is, you know, these words. They talk about hybrid immunity. Yeah, of course, by which they mean, well, you may have had a vaccination and you may also have encountered the virus naturally, and then it gives you sort of a bit of both, right? Yeah, but you don't need the vaccine for getting hybrid immunity, because every time you encounter the virus in a new subvariant, you know, you add to your immunity scope, right? And it's always hybrid, because no two variants. I mean, this virus develops so quickly. So do, I guess, all the other cold viruses. Maybe they don't any longer, but they did at the early stage. Maybe it develops faster at the early stage, and then it sort of settles in, and then the mutations become more slow. That's possible. I think I've talked about that. So maybe it won't mutate as quickly as it did in the first, 2 years in the long run. No, but yeah, it's natural that in the early stage it mutates quickly, right? And as I said, we've accelerated its natural mutation rates thanks to our policies. Our policies have accelerated the virus's mutation rate. Now, if you're a healthy person, that can even be a good thing. Right? Oh, great, then I get used to it even faster. Yeah, that's true. But if you're not a healthy person, or if your immune system isn't tip-top, then that may actually be negative. So our policies may have killed quite a lot of people, and may still kill people going forward, who would maybe without the policies would not have died. So because it has in a way reduced your immune system's ability to respond to natural occurring variations, and at the same time accelerated the variations. It's quite a double whammy. Yeah. Okay. So there's no such thing as guaranteed protection. Yeah. If it comes to reinfection, there's no such thing at all, right? And of course, even the unlikely event of the virus slipping into your lung, you can never have a guarantee against that. Any of the cold or influenza viruses can and occasionally does trigger pneumonia in us. Not in every one of us, but in a certain subset of us. Right? And that will be the same thing with this one. This is no different than all the others. Yeah, of course, there is no guaranteed protection. Right? The only way to protect yourself from life is to be dead. Be my guest. Yeah, so yeah, these articles are disappointing, right? They're 2.5 years into this, people still don't understand what they're talking about. And here's another one, Macau, infections rise. Yeah, the poor people in Macau, now they're finally getting to be exposed to the virus. They talk about, they set up quarantine centers for asymptomatic patients. I've seen that word also used a lot in Singapore as well, but here we are in Macau. Asymptomatic patients. There is no such thing. If you are asymptomatic, you're not a patient. That's the whole point of being asymptomatic. Asymptomatic means you're healthy. So they're locking people up, possibly against their will, possibly against any basic constitution in any country in the world, because there's no due process here. There's no legal, reason for them to. They just simply lock you up, even though you're perfectly healthy, because they have defined patient as anybody who tests positive for this virus, right? Said this for more than 2 years now. This is one of the most dangerous and disappointing developments around this whole COVID affair. Right? That you are stamped as a, here they say patient, but they mean risk factor. Right? You are stamped as a risk factor, as an outcast, as a pariah, because you test positive for a harmless common cold virus. This is extraordinary. And this has been going on not only in Greater China. At least in the early stages, this kind of thing happened in many places. And it is mind-boggling. Virtually nobody says anything, as if people think this is normal or this is how it should be. If they see an animal being mistreated, there's a huge outcry, and on TikTok or Instagram you will get 1 million followers. Oh, how dare he! But 8 billion people have been deprived of their most basic rights, their most basic freedom of even movement, for nothing, for no reason. Yes, Macau has had very few cases because of this policy, yes. And if you continue this for the rest of their lives, people in Macau will not have a normal life because of this policy. Now, don't tell me that that's a success. And as I said many times before, since your immune system is age-dependent, the functioning of your immune system is age-dependent, with every day the government prevents you from encountering the virus, your risk goes up. The government here will be responsible for many, many deaths down the line because of this policy. But of course, by that time, today's politicians will long be gone, and nobody. Oh, we couldn't know that. Right? We had to do what we had to do at the time. Yeah. There is no such thing as an asymptomatic patient. Either you're a patient, that means you have symptoms of some sort, or you're asymptomatic, that means you are not a patient. Right? So there's no middle ground here. This is complete, utter nonsense. And it's not just sort of trivial nonsense that you can laugh about. This is very serious stuff. Very, very serious stuff. This is where humanity goes down the drain. Talking of China, just a few headlines. Since my cover page says still no light at the end of this particular tunnel, the China tunnel, right? Here are a few headlines that I picked up. China's middle class looks to flee as COVID-19 policies bite. Yes, you will inevitably have a brain drain, over time, right? Because more and more people say, look, this is unbearable and it makes no sense. I mean, even in a country like China, where you have very limited access to information, you do have people who can think, right? At least a few, right? And thinking you cannot really prevent. So the longer this goes on, the more people will start saying, look, this isn't right. Right? And the cost of this policy are way higher than the benefits, if any. Yeah. Yeah. And it's clear that this is a totalitarian approach and that it suits the totalitarian regime. I said that very early on, I think almost 2.5 years ago, I said, I see a risk that totalitarian regimes, and not only totalitarian regimes, even the so-called democratic regimes, will abuse this virus for their purposes because it helps them accrue power. It allows them, they think, and people do allow it to them, yeah, to enter a state of exception and to suspend the constitution and basically treat citizens like animals. That's what it does. And I think even in China, there are some people who are maybe starting to question that. Right? And if they cannot stand up to the regime, and you probably can't, the way it's entrenched, then you leave. Right? So yes, there will be a brain drain. High Court dismisses bid by activist Han Hui and others to declare vaccination measures as unlawful. So specifically, I think this activist didn't bid for all vaccination measures to be declared unlawful, but discriminatory, if I remember correctly, discriminatory policies on the part of government agencies and companies who refuse employment to unvaccinated people. And so this activist Han Hui said that is unlawful, to discriminate on the basis of whether or not someone chooses to vaccinate. And the High Court has, I think this is Hong Kong, has, or maybe it's China, has dismissed that bid. In other words, it's lawful to discriminate even in terms of employment between people who are vaccinated and people who are not. I mean, I've talked at length about the discrimination in terms of moving in and out of countries and, even moving in and out of buildings or facilities, and, how terrible that is. But here's yet another thing. It's like you lose your employment unless you vaccinate. Yeah. Thousands joined Singapore gay rights rally. Why is this here? Because I wanted to point, this is actually, a positive thing that, happened in Singapore. They relaunched a gay rally that has happened before COVID on a fairly grand scheme with several thousand participants. There's one place in Singapore in the middle of the sort of in Chinatown, there's a small park, and they call it a speaker's corner, sort of copying, Hyde Park Corner, I think, or whatever the British version of that is. The speaker's corner is the only place in Singapore where you can assemble and give political speeches without permission. It's only one place in all of Singapore where you're allowed to do that. And so these gay rights advocates have been assembling there for some time before COVID, and they restarted it. It was quite a big thing. And you even saw a couple of PAP, meaning the ruling party's members, show up and showing support. I mean, this is interesting, and it's just a data point, but it's interesting that Singapore is renewing the leadership. There's a new generation of leadership coming. They are just the same as the previous ones in many respects. They're just as totalitarian. They have no notion of democracy and freedom, but they want to keep Singapore modern. And they realize, for example, to attract talent, if you discriminate against, for example, gays or other sort of so-called minority groups, you may foreclose yourself from some of the best talent, right? And in that kind of field, the Singaporeans tend to be very pragmatic. Actually, the society as a whole is quite conservative, and there will be many, local Singaporeans who reject gay rights. But the government, since it's a dictatorship, they can basically do what they want. They are sometimes more enlightened than the general population, not because they are liberal, not at all, but because they are pragmatic. They want to bring business to Singapore, right? It makes everybody wealthier, and them especially. and so they tend to sometimes support movements that are global, such as gay rights, or because they want to present themselves as a modern and open economy and attract young talent, the best talent. And whether that person's gay or not, they want to ignore, right? Because they want the talent. Right? So it's a pragmatism. It's not a liberal kind of world view reflected here. Now, possibly the younger generation are slightly more liberal than the older ones, but I don't think there's a big change in that. They've all gone through the same system. They've grown up within the same framework and environment, right? But they constantly update themselves in terms of what is du jour, what is or à jour, what is timely, what is fashionable, and where do we need to be seen to be open to be able to play, right, and attract people, and continue to have this sort of open economy model, managed open economy model, right? So this isn't changing anything really, but it is just showing that they're mindful and observant and quite intelligent, of course, about those choices that they make. And the reason I put this here is because China and Hong Kong aren't doing this, right? And so you will see Singapore benefiting from the China stance. A lot of Hong Kong people are relocating to Singapore, and China-based people are relocating to Singapore, not only foreigners, but also some of the locals. Because relatively speaking, they view Singapore as the more open society than their own, right? Even though it isn't really open, but it has a very good way of pretending, I should say, pretending to be open. It is open in a certain way, and it's open within a very clearly defined boundary. Let's put it this way, if that makes sense, if that's not oxymoronic. Within a certain framework, it is quite open. It is a very enclosed openness. It's like the bird in the cage, right? The bird in the cage, within the cage, and you give him maybe a nice large cage, it can fly freely. It just can't escape the cage. Right? So that is Singapore. But the point I have it here is really to make Singapore is moving ahead and constantly reinventing itself, whereas Hong Kong, for example, is moving backwards. So that makes the contrast between Hong Kong and Singapore, China and Singapore, even more pronounced. There are different types of totalitarian regimes. the Singaporean one is in some ways quite a lot smarter. Now, to be fair to the Chinese, China is 1.45 billion people. Singapore is 5.5 million. And of course, it's easier to play these games with a small city-state than with a very large country. So to be fair, right, I wouldn't be able to say, oh, the Chinese should just copy what the Singaporeans do and they would be wealthier. That would be a step too far. Right? But at this stage, at least between Hong Kong and Singapore, which have seen each other as similarly sized and similarly positioned competitors, the gap is widening, and Hong Kong is just going to lose. Floating Hong Kong restaurant capsizes South China Sea. This is classic. This is an old treasure of Hong Kong, south side of the island. Big floating ship that is a restaurant. Right? It's been there. It was there when I first came to Hong Kong, and I've been there. And it's almost one of those, those classical things that somehow belong to Hong Kong. I don't think in the last few years, they would have done so well even before COVID, because frankly, it was very old-fashioned, I think, and new things pop up all the time, right? So that they've survived for several decades. But when COVID then came, then it really was the end of the enterprise. And then because it's basically, when they closed the restaurant, it's basically useless. It's a huge hulk of steel sitting there in the harbor, I think Aberdeen Harbor or Stanley Harbor, somewhere in the south side of Hong Kong. It was sort of, towed to the quay, to the coast, but it was afloat, right? It wasn't a seagoing ship, but it was afloat. And so the owner apparently had to tow it away to a scrapyard, and it sunk on the way to the scrapyard or wherever it was heading. And I just thought, one, it's sad, it's a little bit of Hong Kong that I actually liked. It's nothing special, that restaurant. It's very touristy, but it's just one of those things that somehow belong to Hong Kong. And to see it capsize, it felt like the end of an era. It felt more like the end of an era than when Batten pulled down the British flag, in 1997. Right? I was there in 1997. I saw it, but it didn't touch me that much at the time. But when I saw this restaurant, this famous old grand lady capsize, that really touched me. But more importantly, I think it was such a profound, image of what's happening with Hong Kong overall. Hong Kong is capsizing. Xi Jinping is in Hong Kong right now celebrating or inaugurating the new local leader. They used to say in China, the mountains are high and the emperor is far away, meaning down in the south of China, they were basically running their own affair. And once a year, the tax person, the imperial tax collector would come and open their hand, and they would have to give them silver. But other than that, they tended to manage their own affairs and felt relatively protected from the mandarins in Beijing or Xi'an or Nanjing or wherever those mandarins were. No longer, right? Now the emperor comes all the way to Hong Kong in the deep south. There's no more hiding place in China. No, none. The whole country is under strict surveillance. Beijing kids must take a PCR COVID-19 test to play in the park. Before you enter the park, there's a nice fence, first a PCR test. What do you say to that? What do you say to that? In Singapore, they put fences around the beaches, and you had to check in with electronic, the surveillance tool that they had. But at least you didn't need a COVID-19 test. in Beijing, you need a test just to enter the park. I feel so sorry for the children of this world. So sorry. Macau, COVID infections rise. Oh, yeah, we saw that. So, yeah. So Macau is now affected, and that's the world's biggest gambling hub and a big source of income for the central government. So they will be running low. So, yeah, but it was inevitable, right? It was just a question of time. Sooner or later, the virus arrives. You can't keep it at bay, right? They've done it apparently for 2 years. I don't know how. Keep it at bay. They must have like multiple layers of protection around people. It's like, I don't know how many tests per day. Whatever they've done, it could not have worked, right? I mean, one thing that was certain was that sooner or later the virus arrives in Macau. 100% certain. So here it is, right? Surprise. Okay, that's China. Here's another interesting graphic I found related to some degree to COVID. Millionaire migration. So these are high net worth individuals, and these are the top 10 countries from which they currently or recently emigrate, as well as the top 10 countries into which they immigrate. So the emigration countries are predictably Russia, because of course the war and the sanctions. I mean, if you're well off, you don't want to have anything to do with the war nor with the sanctions. You don't want to risk your property being confiscated and so on. So, I mean, one of the options is you just leave, right? And some of them may even acquire, a passport, a citizenship somewhere else, right? So that they cannot so easily be have their property, appropriated by Western countries. So Russia is the biggest net outflow of millionaires or high net worth individuals. China is number 2. That's clearly linked to COVID policies, right? Hong Kong, same, 3,000. So those are the big outflow countries. And India is big, so that's interesting. Their COVID policies were not so strict, but they were unpredictable and quite destructive sometimes. So very chaotic. Yeah. So it may have to do with that, or it may have to do with politics. I don't know. But India is also losing possibly many entrepreneurs who are in the IT sector, and who rather want to be Silicon Valley or somewhere else where they can where they can avoid bureaucracy a little bit and so on and do their thing. But I don't know. I mean, they don't show what types are these, right? So I don't really know. I'm speculating. Ukraine, of course, sees a significant outflow. 42% of all their wealthy are predicted to have left by the end of this year. I mean, yeah. I mean, of course, 7 million or 6 million of them have left the country. So, of course, among them, disproportionately, probably the wealthy, for whom it is easiest, relatively speaking, to leave. Right? Brazil. Well, they have this sort of erratic president. Maybe that's got something to do with that. I don't know. And the UK. UK has a significant outflow. So I suspect that's got to do with Brexit, not with COVID or anything, COVID policies. I mean, a lot of people in Britain didn't vote for Brexit, and they are now really feeling the pain. They want to visit their, country home in France, or their finca in Mallorca, or in the golf club on the Costa del Sol, right? And they need a visa, or no, they don't need a visa, but at least they need this electronic pre-registration. They cannot just simply pop over anymore, right? As they could before, when they were a member of the EU. I don't know whether that's it, or there are maybe other things, but yeah. So those are the big emigration countries. And then the immigration countries, number 1, interestingly, UAE, 4,000 are going there. And, that's probably because they make themselves very attractive, like low tax, and you're welcome, and you get a long-term visa without much hassle, and especially if you have money, right? So they make it a business to attract high net worth individuals, offer them a convenient lifestyle, safe and no hassle. Right? Number two, I think, is Australia. That's interesting too. So presumably a lot of the Chinese and Hong Kong, they want to stay in Asia. They want to stay in the time zone. They still have businesses all over there, but they want to be out of China and Hong Kong because it's too restricted. So either they go to Singapore, which is the regional hub down there, which is great as a regional hub, but it's not the place that most people would aspire to when it comes to long-term, having your children educated there or retiring there, right? Australia is probably much more in that league, right? That Australia, there's plenty of space, you can have a beautiful house. It's not any longer very affordable, but it's still affordable for wealthy people to have a beautiful house. Lots of beaches, relaxed lifestyle, you're safe, your money is safe, and you're still in the same, roughly in the same time zone. So I think Australia has a pretty powerful value proposition for Chinese and Hong Kong-based millionaires who want to find a new home. Right? They may not even have to do anything else. They're just, in the right place and the right type of country. Others are Israel is interesting. Maybe there are quite a lot of Jews among the Ukrainians and the Russians, I suspect. Remember, the president of the Ukraine is a Jew. Hitler didn't get all the way to deep into, he got, deep into Russia, but not all the way to Moscow, for example, or even St. Petersburg. So he didn't have a chance to kill them all off, and maybe also not fully in the Ukraine. And although he did occupy pretty much all of the Ukraine briefly, but then lost part of it again. So after Stalingrad. So I don't know the exact history, but I presume there may be quite a lot of Jews, and I presume that among those who migrate to Israel, there could be quite a significant number of Jews, and they are often very well off. So that's, maybe the Israeli government, if you're a Jew, you immediately get citizenship or whatever, right? So it may be attractive, right? And then we have Portugal and Greece. Yeah, those are classic locations for, like, your rich Russians or Ukrainians to have, a safe place, right? It is great weather all year round, beautiful beaches, but within Europe, not too far away from Russia if you want to shuttle back and forth for business. You're within the EU. If you have a long-term visa there, then you can move about the entire EU freely. So very attractive, right? Switzerland also, but Switzerland is just a very classical safe haven, right? So all these Russians have probably a little house on one of the lakes, and then another little house, or maybe a big house, on the ski slopes, right? So Switzerland just is the kind of place that always has been attracting disproportionately, wealthy people. Right? It's an expensive place, so you better be wealthy to retire there. But if you're wealthy, it's not a bad place at all, right? So yeah, there you go. So it's just a run through, but it's interesting how that someone even has the idea to create this graphic, right? So there will always be shifts, migrations of this sort, but now under the COVID regime and plus the war in Ukraine, I think that has really triggered a mass exodus of millionaires from these countries here, mostly in Asia. And I think if I was a policymaker in any of these countries, I would say, yeah, I have bigger problems, but no, this is the problem because they are just the tip of the iceberg, right? They're probably not only losing millionaires; they're probably also losing a lot of young or mobile. Talented, well-trained people who are not millionaires, but who are, the talent of the future, and they go elsewhere. There you go. Another stark graphic that I found, it almost needs no explanation, right? I was wondering why in about 2010, 2011, the increase in tourist arrivals steepened. Yeah, so the rate of acceleration increased. So until about 2010, you can see that It gradually grew, the number of arrivals, and then since 2010, it grew more rapidly. And my hypothesis is that it's Chinese who started to travel in large numbers around that time, and then followed by Indians who started to travel in large numbers more recently. And Thailand has got a fair market share both among the Chinese travelers and among Indian travelers. So Thailand has really benefited from, China and India having an increasingly well-off middle class that can afford foreign travel. Boom, and then comes COVID, rather COVID policies, and it goes to literally zero. At the peak in 2019, 40 million visitors. Spending an average of, say, 5 days and spending an average of, say, $150 per day. So that's, to make it simple number, it's like 10,000, we spend, let's say, $1,000 per person per trip, right? And you have 40 million off. So that's what, 40 billion US dollars in tourism revenues? Gone. Tourism accounted, pre-COVID, accounted for 20% of Thai employment and 11 or 12% of Thai GDP. It's labor intensive, so the number is higher for employment than for GDP. The single biggest industrial sector, industry or economic sector, I think, in Thailand, is tourism, and they went to zero. Predictably, then, Thailand had one of the steepest GDP drops of any country during COVID, and it's only now recovering. Now they have dropped as of 1st of July this year, so a week ago. Today's the 1st of July, but they dropped it a few days before. So about a week ago, they dropped all restrictions, including mask wearing, indoor and outdoor, which is quite radical for Asian country. But the funny thing is that almost no Thais stop wearing masks. They have been so used to this virus being dangerous, and you have to wear a mask, and you have to protect yourself, and you have to protect others, and courtesy, and the whole story that is, as I say, all wrong. They have been so inundated with that story that they don't want to go back to normal. Now it's the policy has been dropped, and the government has announced it. And the governor of Bangkok went jogging in the morning without a mask to demonstrate, we mean it. But the vast majority of people on the streets in Bangkok are wearing masks, and whether indoor or outdoor. As if they don't believe their government. No, the government, they just want to foster tourism and so on and so forth. But no, we don't believe this is so dangerous. You need to wear a mask. Yeah, it's amazing what these kind of policies do to you, right? Because when the government of a country takes drastic measures, I talked about Merkel just closing the borders, right, which is unheard of, right, in March 2020, and it was a shock to me. Right? What it does is, of course, it transports the message to people that A, this virus is really dangerous, and B, the government knows something that they don't tell us. Their actions speak louder than words, and their actions are so radical. This must be really, really bad. Right? That's the message you convey with these strict measures. Right? And after 2 years of the strict measures, people have become so not just used, but so penetrated by this idea that that's what it is. It's just dangerous, and you have to wear a mask, and that they no longer follow the new policy. I mean, you would have thought that they, finally, I get rid of this damn mask, but no. And I went into a bank without a mask, naturally, and they made me wear a mask. And I said, but hey, the policy has changed. It's voluntary now, and I don't want to wear a mask. It's indoor, and in the bank, you have to wear a mask. So this is not a government bank, or this is just a private enterprise, but they set their own rules now that are stricter than the government rules. So the echo I think what this says is the echo of these measures will reverberate for a long time to come, because only very slowly do people really go back to normal. Now, it depends on the country, but some countries will be different than others. Some countries in Africa maybe never left the normal, therefore they don't have to return to it. But this long road to normalcy is a long road. Government in Thailand now is saying, oh, we may get 7 or 8 million tourists this year. Yes, they're on track to that. Maybe the curve here shows it, right? And the main season is coming in November, December, so they will hope by that time, hopefully, the world will have realized that Thailand no longer has any restriction. Actually, that's not entirely true. You have to be vaccinated to enter the country, and if you're not vaccinated, you have to take a PCR test. So actually, there is a restriction. But other than that, they have no more restrictions, both to enter and also inside the country. Once message spreads, then you can expect that towards the end of the year, really people may start coming back in force, right? So the projection of 7 to 8 million is perhaps realistic, right? However, it was 40 million 2 years ago or 3 years ago, right? And it was more than 7 or 8 million 20 years ago. So yes, Thailand is going back to normal, and that's great, but not so fast. I fear, right? Not so fast. I mean, this curve, this drop is just incredible. From 40 million to practically zero in like no time. I was in a hotel in Phuket in February 2020, it so happens. And the hotel manager was a German, and he came past the breakfast table and we chatted, and he realized I'm German, or I realized he's German, we chatted a bit. And he said, and I said, and just the first sort of news were coming in about COVID in like Italy, or the early outside China, the early places where they had fatalities, etc. And I said, but the hotel is Chinese New Year, right? It's a busy period of February, right? I said, hotel is busy, right? It's not yet affected. And he said, as of next week, literally all the Chinese have canceled their bookings, 100%, because the Chinese government had announced that they would close the borders, and you had like so many days time to sneak in before they closed it, right? And so overnight the hotel was emptied because most of their visitors their guests were Chinese. And anyways, it was right after Chinese New Year, so we were also going to leave anyways. So. And he said, this week we are busy, and next week will be completely empty. I mean, and you can see that in this curve, because tens of thousands of hotels have had that experience, just like that German hotel manager. Yeah. So this is not going to bounce back so quickly. People are wary now. They still think that the virus, they still overestimate the dangers associated with the virus. They may also overestimate the bureaucracy involved, the restrictions. If you're vaccinated, you don't have really a restriction, but they may treat cautiously to go further away from home. So Europeans right now are all traveling within Europe, and they feel comfortable doing that, and far fewer than usual go further away. And then, it will come back, but it will take 2-3 years or more. And plus we have a recession, or it feels like a recession. And so people will anyways hold back with these types of spending. So for Thailand, this is just the beginning of the end. We are nowhere near the end of this disaster. But it's maybe opening up as of 1st of July is maybe the beginning of the end of the disaster. But it will be a slow, several-year recovery, I think. And it's done nothing, right? I mean, the virus is in the country anyways, right? So the closed borders is irrelevant. Right? Or if you're Macau and you can close them so tightly that really the virus doesn't get in, you're just postponing the inevitable at a very high cost and pain to your people. Right? For years and years and years, you imprison them just to delay a virus that comes anyways. Right? And remember, a few years later, they're all a few years older. Right? And all of them have a higher risk profile than they would have to start with, right? Just remember that, right? That's all part of the effects of these policies. Ja, Gelassenheit. Let's take a break. Yeah. Scenarios. So a couple of months ago, I saw a bit of an uptick in our, where we are on the scenarios. I said we are starting to move back to a little bit of an early spring. Remember, even China, I was positive about the fact that they actually announced a few fatalities. And I thought a dam had been broken. And once you announce a few fatalities, then you can start building on that and you can announce more and more without losing face and all that stuff. But I was wrong. I mean, instead of using that opening to start, opening, they have just become more restrictive. They put the lid that was starting to lift off a little bit, they've to put it straight back. So China is actually back down. Right? And last time I talked about in Singapore, they talk about near normal. Yeah? They don't talk about getting back to normal. No, they talk about near normal, and that means all kinds of hassle. Right? In certain venues, you have to wear a mask, and you need to have a vaccination to do certain things, and all these unnecessary restrictions. And when people start giving it a name, I get worried, right? Because it starts being entrenched. You get to the point where people think we cannot go back to normal. I think a lot of people in places like Singapore really believe that. They believe it's not possible to just let go of all the restrictions. So they are talking about near normal, which means it's not normal. And so Singapore may not be normal for years and years and years to come. And Singapore is just one example. It's just because I picked up that term, near normal, in Singapore, maybe it's being used elsewhere. But I'm not, the effect is not limited to Singapore, right? So you have many governments who are basically loosening some of the restrictions and maybe avoiding the heaviest of the restrictions, such as lockdowns, but have a whole slew of subtle restrictions that make your life complicated and senseless. Child vaccines, I talked about it earlier. I mean, that's really disappointing. That's taking us straight back down into destructive. And then the talk about subvariants. People could. I mean, everybody knows that that viruses mutate, that they have variants and subvariants. I mean, why do people keep panicking? This is sort of panic talk, right? Another subvariant. Yeah, of course. But every time it's like panic, panic, panic. Why? What's the purpose? Yes, there will be 1,000 more subvariants over the next, I don't know, decades or 100 years. Yes. So what? Let's stop talking about them. They are irrelevant. Yeah. But that's the thing. People don't stop talking about it, and they talk about it in the wrong way. It's counterproductive. Okay, so I thought maybe we were starting to move towards early spring, but not so fast. Numbers, yeah, I've made a couple of modifications as I usually do half year. I've updated the populations of the countries. And since in most countries population is growing, means the base is bigger, and therefore the percentage, if the number of infected people doesn't change, then the percentage will be lower, right? Because the base, which is the total population, is bigger. So that has a bit of a dampening effect on the percentage here, right? So this month it's still 93% as it was last month. Now, because I'm rounding, now it's this month is 93.1%, and last month it was 92 point something. But so it's just a rounding effect. So it's grown slightly, but insignificantly, and partially because of that modification. Because every 6 months I raise the population figures, adjust them in the model, and it means it suppresses the percentage of infected people a little bit, by maybe 1 percentage point, or maybe even less than 1 percentage point. Yeah? So it's not a big deal, but just to report. The other thing I've updated, I was using the proportion of population that is above 65 is one of my key drivers of the tailoring the infection fatality rate, the IFR, to the countries in my model. So the average globally in my model is 0.23%, average IFR, but I then tailor it to each country in my model. I have about 25 or so countries in the model, based on percentage of population older than 65, percentage of population that is severely overweight or obese, and percentage of population that is diabetic. Right now, those overlap. Right, so there's a bit of a gray. There's a lot of gray matter here, because of course you can be both overweight and diabetic, right, and over 65. Right. So, but I calibrate that a little bit, and it's all magic. Can't explain it. But I'm trying to, based on the data from research I've tried to calibrate a little bit. So by far the biggest factor is age, but then the other 2 factors also. But and there's number 4 factor is quality of the healthcare system. So I use some global ranking of quality of healthcare system, which is, I know it's not very fine-tuned, and I use that as another factor. And then I show it all together into a pot and stew it, and you get certain numbers, right? I just try to have some reasonable assessment around what could be the IFR in those key countries, right? Because if you are a country, take Germany, one of the highest average, age, or rather percentage of population that is over 65 in the world. Japan is, I think, the highest, but Germany is, and then I think after Japan, maybe Italy, and then Germany or so, right? At least among the countries in my model. So, Germany is up there as one of the most elderly societies in the world. Relatively high obesity and overweight, and sort of average diabetes, right? And a pretty high score for the healthcare system. So I mix that together, and then what I get is that the IFR for Germany is 0.475 or so. Yeah. So if the global average is 0.23, in Germany it's double that, more than double that actually, and that's just simply because of the demographics of Germany. Right? And I've done that for the other 25 countries as well. So at least per country that is in my model, I can fine-tune the penetration, the infection level a little bit based on those drivers. And it's not completely out of thin air, because I did look at some studies and how impactful, but there's a lot of just doing magic, and it's not precise. It's not really, if you want, scientific, but it is reasonably plausible to me. Yeah, that's the test. Is it plausible? Yeah, it's reasonably plausible. So that's what I have, right? So I didn't update the other drivers. I just updated the percentage of population above 65. And because that changes differently in different countries, also the source was different. Now my data is from the World Bank. The previous source was the UN, but the UN hasn't updated since 2019. And when I saw that the World Bank has more recent figures from 2021, 2 years younger, and their figures were quite compatible with the UN figures, just across the board slightly higher, as you would expect, but quite compatible, I thought. I just switched from one source to another. So again, that's not very scientific, right? You change the source. And all kinds of uncertainties creep in, but because it looked plausible, and because there was no single country where it seemed like really out of whack, I just took the new source, which is the World Bank. Yeah, and so across the board, the percentage of people above 65 years of age has gone up, but in some countries more than in others. So that sort of redistributes slightly the penetration rates, right? But it doesn't affect the overall, the 93% here. It just only affects the countries within my model. Yeah, so nothing too exciting here. Same as fatalities. At the moment, Northern Hemisphere is summer, so fatalities are going slowly. As you can see here, the green line is sort of, it's my calculated COVID fatalities, not the reported ones, but both the reported and the calculated fatalities are going slowly at the moment. And then for the overall excess mortality, I have no new data, so I just kept it flat. Even the economists didn't really have, which is usually quite quick, didn't really have new data. The problem is that a lot of countries only report this once a year, usually at the beginning of the year. So by February, March, you get that figure for that country for that year, but then you have to wait another year. Unless someone like the Lancet study or the World Health Organization choose to go in maybe halfway through the year and do a survey, right? And send a petition to government and say, please report to us. We want to get a picture, right? They can do that, right? And then you get more frequent updates if several either university study groups or global organizations like the World Health Organization, if they do that, you may get a few data points per year, but we'll see. At the moment, therefore, I'm basically stuck with my updated as of March, I think. Let me see. Oh, no, this is per 31st December last year. But the latest figures only came in like March or even April, right? Remember? So I kept, actually, even in May here, I then reduced it a bit because the latest data came in only in May and they were a bit lower. And then I just sort of finger in the air, adjusted for that, right? So I'm just below 20 million. That's what it is. So at the moment, that top line remains flat, whereas the COVID curve will continue creeping up. And then when the autumn comes, it will go up a bit more. But it's as expected, as it approaches the roughly 15 million that you're expecting based on IF of 0.23. As it approaches that 15 million, it will grow slowly, right? Because it cannot reach that curve. It can only sort of approach it by definition, the way I've defined it. Yeah, so this is all unexciting. Then I have my seasonal progressions for four Northern Hemisphere countries. And I've added another little bump. So I've extended my graphic into next year. Sorry, this should say September 23, not September 24. That's a typo. So I've extended my graphic up to September 23. What it tells you is that I am intending to carry on a bit, and that maybe at least I want to see the next autumn-winter cycle, and at least have a complete 3-year period. So that would at least take us to March 23. And then maybe at some point I will stop. And I want to see whether this pattern of seasonal humps that gradually decline in amplitude, that continues. I mean, that's what you expect, right? Based on the logic that we get ever more immunized, the more we are exposed. So the longer this progresses, the fewer fatalities, right? That's what I said 2.5 years ago at the very beginning of this. That's what you would expect with a cold virus, right? That in the early stage, because it's new, may create problems for your immune system, but the longer it's around, the fewer problems it will create, right? And it is seasonal, like any cold virus. So in the winter season and autumn season, you get more of it. So all of that was quite predictable 2 years ago. And all I'm doing now, I'm basically just tracking to empirically confirm what conceptually is anyways clear. Okay. Here we have Germany. They're a bit up and downy. Right now it's up again a bit because it's holiday season, so there's more movement, right? So you get a bit more. But generally, Germany, of course, has some way to catch up. Germany is still only 50% penetrated, according to my model. So there are still a lot of people in Germany who haven't had the virus because of these hefty restrictions in the winter of 21, and then again in the winter of 22. And I don't presume that the Germans are learning. So I almost expect that in the winter of 23, there will be yet more restrictions. We'll see. Because they're just not really learning to abandon these restrictions. So you get this effect that you get a bump down where the instructions are imposed, and then they are slowly, gradually loosened again because you can't keep them up very long, and you get a bit of the yo-yo effect that I talked about. Right? Not too strongly in Germany. UK has more strongly yo-yo effect. US, as I always said, is a bit different, the seasonality, because it's a huge country and it has different climate zones, etc., etc. But nothing unusual there. And here's Britain. It's more spiky because of the policy mix having been erratic. Right? They hammer and then they let go, and then they hammer again and they let go, and so there's a strong yo-yo effect. Right? So I said before, if their objective was to minimize the peak traffic of patients into intensive care units or into hospitals in general, which they declared to be their one of the main objectives, they got it precisely wrong, especially in the winter of 2020, where they erratically, went back and forth with policies and couldn't make up their mind. Do we let it go? Do we not? Right? And it was just very up and downy. I think the UK is one of those countries that have learned a little bit, and they've avoided some of that. Divergence, as always, Sweden still is a long way from having 99% herd immunity. The vaccination rate has essentially stalled, as it has in many European countries. So the vaccination now activity is quite low, mostly limited to elderly who get a booster. And the infection rate is still well below 50%. So despite having been one of the most open countries, the infection rates are actually low, at least calculated. I said before, I'm not sure about that number. Strikes me as implausible. Infection ratio in Sweden should be higher than this, but okay. Germany has a very long way to go because of generally restrictive policies, and their vaccination rate has also stalled. And then, of course, the usual suspects, Japan and South Korea, they have the longest way to go because they are most restrictive. And Thailand is now rapidly, maybe becoming at least a muddle-through country, or you could even say a back-to-normal country. But let's see whether it lasts, right? If there's a spike in cases or in fatalities, maybe the governments go straight back to reimposing things. So I don't want to lean out of the window too much on that one. Nothing has changed here. Nothing has changed here. Nothing much has changed here. We are only 1 million away from the calculated total fatalities. That gap is closing, right? And at the same time, the gap between excess mortality and those who are killed in conjunction with COVID is widening or at least stable. So it's a huge gap. Vaccination mania, okay, there's not that much to say. I said a lot about it last time. And the reason there's not that much to say is because thankfully, vaccination mania is really coming, apparently it's coming to an end. We'll see, but apparently it's coming to an end. Right? So most countries have tried to vaccinate large parts of the population, twice with double shot. Some countries have also very actively pushed boosters, but on the whole, people just aren't bothering anymore. So yeah, so people are starting to maybe just get used to the virus. And they could start to get used to the notion that no, it doesn't protect you from reinfection. Protect from reinfection. I think people start, even though some media is still talking about those things, I think people are starting to realize that. There are now quite a lot of people in the West who have already had 2 or even 3 symptomatic infections, right? So they know, oh, I've had it, or maybe then they go test and it's positive. So there are quite a lot of people who realize, oh, it's just going to be with us, right? And so in that moment where that sinks in, it's then easier to let go, because you say, okay, then it's just force majeure, right? Can't be helped, right? And then you relax. As long as you feel you can fight it, you're tense, right? But the moment you say, oh, actually, I can't really fight it, and it's okay, then you relax, right? So I think we are seeing a little bit of that in some countries. Long-term scenarios, yeah, I don't want to dwell on those. Nothing new to report. Yeah, and Doraemon is still standing on his head. As long as we're not finding a proper language and concept and conversation about COVID and this virus, as long as we are basically talking a whole lot of nonsense about it, he will be standing on his head. With that, see you in a month. Take care. Bye.